everyone in the room. This, of course, is the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. Not the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival, but the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival for 2021. It's good to be back in the room. So much of us, so many of us missed out on this, of course, during lockdown. And for those of us who released books during lockdown, it was even harder, of course, to get interest and get some traction around the books when we couldn't have meetings such as these. I want to welcome everyone joining us on Zoom. I was told that we have as many people, if not more, joining us on Zoom today as we do in the room. So that's fantastic. A bit of a sign of the times as well, I think. Now, you're all going to get a chance to ask some questions. So make sure you think of a few good questions as we go along. And if you are on Zoom, send through your questions because we'll be able to ask those as well. And I think people might be joining us from local libraries as well. Yeah, across the state, which is fantastic. Libraries are great places, so welcome wherever you're joining us from. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we're standing here today. It's special for me because I have family connection here as well. On my father Wiradjuri and my mother Gamilaroi, but I also have a great-great-grandfather who is a Dharawal man, whose family came from La Perouse and, of course, is part of a broader Eora Nation, and who was living as a boy not far from where we are today, who was as a boy was living in the old boat sheds at Circular Quay in the 1850s, and of course watching this whole city grow up around them, the remnants of the first people. His grandparents would have been on the shore and seeing the boats arrive. So it's a very deep and personal connection that I have to this place as well. So it's fantastic to be here and be involved in this conversation. We're here in the Metcalfe Auditorium, of course, for this discussion. I should tell you who I am. I'm
No, you need to.
No. I'm Stan Grant. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I'm here with Tim Ayliffe, who is an author and also my boss. So I get to ask questions of someone who determines what I do on a daily basis. Tim, of course, is at the ABC and one of the senior news executives there, who runs the news channel in particular, and doing a fantastic job of that. And of course, a published author as well. We're here to talk about one of his books today, but maybe we'll get to discuss some of the others as well. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping announcements. As you've all seen, we're following COVID protocols. We're all double vaxxed. We've all checked in with our QR codes. We all have to keep our masks on, except for Tim and I. Except when eating or drinking. So if you've got a bottle of water, my wife, who I've just spotted taking, she never goes anywhere without a bottle of water or a coffee now. It's her little get out of jail free card, you see. She can always hold the bottle of water up and not have to wear the mask, because she falls asleep if she wears a mask for more than 5 minutes. Social distancing, of course, we're restricted for numbers in the room, and you are all adequately distanced, I can see as well. Of course, hand sanitizer is available at the door, and let any volunteers know if you feel unwell. If you're watching remotely, mute your mobile phones, where I'm asking you as well to please not record the session. If you're taking photos in the room, please turn off the flash. Feel free to share on social media. Bad Crime Sydney is the hashtag. At Bad Crime Sydney, and hashtag is Bad Crime Sydney. And we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, as well, as I said. So prepare those questions. If you're on Zoom, send them through the chat function. And about 20 minutes before the end of the session, we'll do our best to include some of those questions. I wanted to start, though, with a reading from Tim to sort of set the scene for this book, and to introduce you to the character who runs through all of Tim's book, the journalist John Bailey. So I'll get Tim to start with the reading, and then we'll get into the conversation. Tim?
Bailey was slowly making his way through the crowd, head bowed, avoiding eye contact with the mostly white men with fashy haircuts, tattoos and ill-fitting stonewashed jeans, some of them with Australian flags tied around their necks, all of them with hard faces. The Patriots. "Excuse me, brother." Bailey felt a heavy hand on his shoulder, turning to see a tall man with a square jaw looking down on him. He had a web tattoo inked into his neck and a spider climbing the side of his shaved head. Thug art. Me and my boys are up front, he said, motioning to get past. No worries. Bailey stepped aside, nodding at the trail of men with crew cuts and Union Jacks plastered on their blue t-shirts. He recognized them instantly. The Blue Boys, a far-right nationalist group that had recently had its Facebook page shut down after they were caught praising the gunmen who had shot up those mosques in Christchurch, killing 51 innocent people. Bailey checked his ticket on his mobile phone. Thankfully, he'd been seated up the back where he could make a quick exit if things turned ugly. He stared at his ticket a moment longer, shaking his head at the price tag. $1,000 to listen to Augustus Strong, the race-baiting doyen of America's alt-right movement and favourite among neo-Nazis and far-right nationalists. What a rip-off. At least Bailey hadn't personally paid for his seat. The magazine had picked up the bill because he was there for a story, different from the ones he'd spent years chasing in the Middle East. His first article for Inquirer magazine, a feature about Augustus Strong's visit to Australia. The warehouse reminded Bailey of an old mechanic's garage, grease stains on the floor, corrugated iron roller doors tarred with paint and rust, brick walls chipped and scarred. There were dozens of old warehouses in this part of Sydney. Most of them had been converted into trendy apartments, cafes and restaurants, clothing outlets, or function spaces for parties and events like the one Bailey was attending tonight. The location of the warehouse had been kept secret with a message sent out to ticket holders an hour before to let them know where to go. Bailey had made it with plenty of time to spare because Darlinghurst, the Darlinghurst end of Surrey Hills, was next door to Paddington, the suburb where Bailey lived in a single-storey townhouse. The warehouse was so close that Bailey had decided to leave his car at home and walk. The protesters hadn't taken long to get there either. On his way, Bailey had counted at least a dozen people holding placards on the footpath outside. He knew the number would swell. Before Strong had arrived in Australia, he had been front page news after it emerged that the Home Affairs Minister had personally intervened to grant him a visa, despite warnings from intelligence officials that the controversial figure's visit could incite violence.
Thank you, Tim. That's an introduction to the main characters in this book, the theme of the book. In the book, The Enemy Within deals with the rise of far-right nationalism and terrorism. But I want to just drill down on the character himself, Bailey, who runs through each of your books. And some of you in the room or watching online may have read some of these books already and been familiar with the character. But where did the idea for Bailey come from? And is he based on any particular person?
Always a difficult question to answer. Look, hello, everyone. I didn't say hello at the start. I got straight into the book, but it's great that, thanks so much for coming and for those joining online as well. Look, John Bailey is an amalgam of many different people, really. I mean, I've been working as a journalist for over 20 years in the UK with British Sky News and in Australia with briefly Channel 7, but most of my career has been at the ABC. Throughout the sort of late 90s and into the noughties, we've had a lot of conflicts going on around the world, and so in London it was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan where I was covering that with Sky and working with a lot of those correspondents that were going there and back, and then those that have worked in the Balkans covering that conflict in the first Gulf War as well. I would see a lot of that PTSD in these correspondence. And then, my time at the ABC as well, and like a lot of our conversations about some of the things that you've covered as well, and some of the things that you've seen. And it became really clear to me that those that are on that correspondence path, and investigative journalists too, it's a certain type of breed. It's a dogged determination to find out the truth. But then there's also almost an addictive adrenaline rush of being there on the ground in the story as it's unfolding. And that's a hell of a train to try to get off. So I'd see that.
And he is, isn't he? This is part of the personal arc of Bailey, that it's not just the struggle with, dealing with the stories he's telling now, but unraveling all that stuff that he's seen.
Yeah, so Bailey, as an amalgam of all the sort of correspondence and somewhat a little bit of my experience as well, he is a former war correspondent. He headed off to firstly Beirut in the late 80s as a young man. bumped into Ronnie Johnson, a CIA agent, very early on in the piece, and CIA officer, I should say. And Ronnie, is a central character to my books as well. But Bailey's journey from, covering, a civil war in Lebanon into covering the first Gulf War, into the Balkans, and then into the second Iraq War and Afghanistan. He got addicted to that role that he felt was so important, and it is important. But at the same time, he's got a young wife and a daughter, and he couldn't do both. And he absolutely failed as a husband and a father, and all that broke down for him. So where the book starts, The Greater Good, which is my first book, is Bailey in Sydney trying to reconnect with his daughter that he'd been a terrible father to. He'd had a breakdown in Iraq. He was kidnapped and tortured. And by the way, it's an awful story in terms of what happened to Bailey, but this has happened to journalists all around the world, and pretty regularly, I should say, which is quite alarming. So even though some of what I write in the book, all of it is obviously fiction, but it's based and rooted in fact. In fact, everything in my books either has happened, could happen, or will happen. That includes what's happened to the people in there. So Bailey, in that first book, and I, with all of my books, they're written as standalones, but it's part of a series. There are always sort of flashbacks or reminders to that past, because it's something that he can never really let go, and it defines him.
And really critical to that is credibility. If you're going to take something like that on, you're going to write about something like that, then it has to ring true. And reading your books, and having lived that life myself as a foreign correspondent, where I covered those wars, in the Balkans, in Northern Ireland, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, many of the things that you talk about with Bailey, I've experienced and seen, but it's the little details that really rang true with me. You talk about the need for routine, the little things that he looks for in his life to help him put back the pieces of his life. And the dog, and this was a really nice touch, and it really spoke to me, because you have a dog given to him by his daughter that she gives to him for a reason, and the dog becomes an important touchstone for him. And I remember when I was reporting a lot of these places, coming back home when we were living either in the Middle East or we were living in Beijing, and when I'd come back home, my connection to my dog and the relationship with the dog, and getting up in the morning and going for a walk with the dog, anchored me. It gave me something in my life. And this is that little touch in your book was a really lovely touch. Tell us about the dog and the role the dog plays, and the connection to Bailey and his daughter, and why you thought that was important to add.
So look, Bailey's a recovering alcoholic.
Which I'm not, by the way. I'm happy to say.
And Bailey's not you. But look, he's constantly battling the booze. He used to use that to self-medicate. And in this life that he's driven by his job, and that's the thing that gives him purpose. He needs routine, and he has reconnected with his daughter, and they have a great relationship. In what happens in my second book is incredibly traumatic for Bailey. So in the third book, The Enemy Within, which is my new one, his daughter is giving him a rescue greyhound. I've got a rescue greyhound, and it's absolutely based on my dog, because they are beautiful dogs, and they're very gentle, they're great listeners, and they're great company. And for Bailey, it gives him a reason to get up each day, to make sure he's off the booze, to get up and walk his dog around.
It was a really important touch, Tim, because it's a human touch.
Yep.
And it connects you to him in a really human way. And for me, having experienced those things, it absolutely resonated. What's the dog's name, by the way? This will give you another clue to Tim's range of interests that he includes in the book.
So look, to set it up, the dog was given to him as a gift, obviously, to watch over him in a way. It's a female dog, but Bailey is Bailey. He's one of the most stubborn human beings that it has ever been invented. Maybe I should say. No, but the dog is a female dog, but he calls the dog Campo, because he loves rugby union. He loves the Wallabies, and he's really annoyed at the state of rugby in Australia at the moment. And he harks back to another age. And his daughter says to him something like, "You can't call the dog Campo. It is a girl." And he said, "Well, Campo was very graceful on the field." So that's where the name came from.
And Tim and I are known to swap texts during Wallabies games as well. So it's another connection that we have. Now we're here to talk about the age of extremes, and I suppose that runs through all of your books, that we're living through an incredibly tumultuous time. You know, and I've been fortunate enough, and I touch on this in a recent book that I've released, with the falling of the dusk, where I don't think we have seen as many moving parts as we do right now, other than perhaps the lead up to World War One. You know, there are so many moving parts in our world right now. If you think of the last 20 years, of course, we have well, you can go back even further than that. Go back to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. A couple of years later, the end of the Soviet Union. You know, there's sort of America emerges as this dominant, unrivaled power in the world. And then only 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, you have the attacks on 9/11. The attacks on 9/11, which then triggered the wars of Afghanistan, Iraq, the global financial crisis, now dealing with a pandemic, the Trump years, the rise of terrorism, right-wing terrorism, Islamist terrorism, populist politics, identity politics, receding democracy, the rise of China, the return of Russia, all of these moving parts. And we talk about war, and we talk about the possibility of global conflict more now than any time that I can remember. And you've included all of this in your books. What are you trying to grapple with, Tim, when you set this character Bailey against these times? And how does that connect to your job as a journalist as well?
I mean, first of all, I wanted to set global thrillers in Sydney, because the world is a much more connected place than it's ever been. And so I was determined to do that, because I feel that we are connected to what's going on in the world. And in fact, with my first book, The Greater Good, and I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again for those who haven't heard, but I was in the US State Department there on a trip where I wasn't allowed to work as a journalist. It was one of those observing trips where people used to joke that you're there to be recruited by the CIA. But and I'm in a conversation with the official in the US State Department, and I can't really talk about the things we spoke about, but I can tell you one thing, a question that I was asked, which was, could I ever imagine a day when Australia would turn its back on the United States in favor of a closer relationship with China? And this is the world we're living with now. Like, there is suspicion and trust issues in a global, in terms of the global order. And we are seeing a rise of another superpower. And at no time in history, in living history, has there ever been more than one dominant global power. And when there is more than one, it leads to one thing, and that is war. So yes, that is something that worries me. But one of the key things with my books, and it's all through all of them, is the fact, the issue we have now around misinformation, around the way that we communicate. And so I think of this time as very similar to back just before, as the Nazis were coming into power. The invention of the microphone, the condenser microphone, and the PA system. The Nazis, perfected how to brainwash a people and how to control a mass. And why I compare that to now is that with social media, we have this sort of ungovernable wasteland, right? Where everyone's opinion matters as much as the facts. And that is deeply disturbing, because now we see people jumping online looking for someone to agree with rather than for someone to actually tell them the truth.
And you're right at the heart of this too, because you're working in media. It's interesting you talk about technology, because there is a connection between technological breakthrough, upheaval in our world, and conflict. The Gutenberg press gave rise to the 30 Years' War. It's said that the microphone gave us Hitler. Without the microphone, without Leni Riefenstahl's films particularly, he's a Munich bar hall, rabble rouser, but his voice is projected even further. And now they say, of course, that social media and Twitter gives us Donald Trump. And you're working in the middle of this too, Tim. Just to reflect on your job as a journalist, and particularly the role that you play in 24/7 News, heading up the news channel. In many respects, 24/7 News is part of the problem too, isn't it? It speeds up events. We expect answers immediately. We expect decisions on the run. Everything happens in quick time. How do you balance that with the responsibility that we have to ensure that people have perspective, have depth, have a true understanding of a world that can appear to be moving so fast?
Slow the news cycle down. That's the mantra that I've been walking around our building saying for a very long time. Slow down, explain the story. And for us, I think 24-hour news in Australia really sort of, I guess, kicked off with the ABC's news channel after 10 years of Sky. Media conferences live all the time, politicians. Well, they start.
But politicians expect to be taken live. They'll often call, dueling press conferences to ensure that they're on instead of the other person.
So we're taking fewer of them because they're telling lies. So for us, our job now is to really has been more and more so. Like you as a journalist, you're fact checking to write a story, you create the story, you publish the story. Things are now happening live. If you are not taking an approach that allows you to fact check, to be able to tell people, oh, hang on, that was bullshit, then you're not doing your job properly. So that's something that we've been trying to do. And, we've been doing some of that together, Stan. I mean, you think of, the stuff we've been doing with Casey Briggs throughout the pandemic, slow things down, give people the facts. There's all the data. You go make up your mind. But you've got all the facts now because of what we've just given you, rather than have a discussion where you've got someone with one view and someone with another. You don't know who's right, but this guy or woman sounds more like someone I'd agree with. I'm going to go with them. That is, that's a problem. That's what Fox News has done. That's certainly what Sky News Australia has been doing, particularly after dark. For us, slowing things down and just trying to present the facts as much as possible is what we're trying to do. And it's a constant battle. But just on the social media companies, Facebook's starting to pay for things. Google is starting to pay for things. They are now giving money to broadcasters, to journalism, the people that are doing that hard work. That is a good sign. They've got to do a lot more. They've got to pay a lot more.
And the public has to expect a lot more too, because it's often said, you get the politicians or the media that you deserve.
Yeah.
And if, we live in a world where people often don't want to seek out other forms of information or live in our own echo chambers, not read more widely or challenge your own view. It's important for us to be active in this moment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to have conversations like this is great to be able to say it out loud. I mean, I don't often speak this bluntly, to be honest with you, about these sorts of issues. But so with Twitter, for instance, this is where, Donald Trump really got his messages out to the masses. And, he told something like 25,000 lies in the 4 years of government. Like, it's just extraordinary that they were keeping track. I think the New York Times was keeping track. Maybe it's 20,000, but it's a lot. So Twitter, right? You can have an anonymous account on Twitter. That means you can troll whoever you want, abuse whoever you want, publish whatever you want, and you can hide by doing it. So we asked Twitter the question, will you make people actually have an identity on Twitter? Absolutely not. It's off the table. It breaks their business model. They will lose, I don't know, I'm total guess, I don't know, a third of users maybe for a company worth what Twitter's worth. That's a lot of billions.
And this, to bring this back to the enemy within, because this sits at the heart of this. John Bailey is an anachronism in many respects. He's this man out of time, isn't he? He's someone for whom truth and facts matter in a world where, as Friedrich Nietzsche once said, there are no facts, only interpretations. And you put him in the middle of this story where there is a right-wing rabble-rouser who's come to Australia on a speaking tour. Bailey's said about doing a profile of him, trying to infiltrate this man's supporters. But he's also conflicted. He's lost his job. He's working for a new startup that's being funded by a guy that he doesn't particularly like, a rich guy with deep pockets who has his own motivation and his own ideas of what truth might be. And he's right in the middle of it. He's an old-fashioned person seeking old-fashioned truth in a world where truth is something that we're forgetting to, unable to even identify.
Yeah, and look, there are a series of racist attacks on Sydney streets happening at this time as well. And so Bailey is on the trail trying to find out, you know, what's going on. And this far right, you know, nationalist movement, it's not just happening here. It's happening all over the world. We've got far right nationalist leaders in over half a dozen countries now. And so he's deeply concerned about that. At the same time, the AFP, Australian Federal Police, has taken an unusual interest in him, chasing the source of a story that he wrote many years
in
earlier.
Afghanistan.
Yeah, in Afghanistan, about you know, alleged human rights abuses by Australian soldiers. So, you know, there's a little bit of sort of truth in there as well. However, so I'm mentioning that because you were asking earlier about how real a character Bailey is and the world in which we're in. The warrant that's used to raid Bailey's house, they raid his house looking for the source of this story, is very similar to the warrant that was used to raid the ABC. And I was sitting at my desk that day. I remember, you know, our editor of the news channel, Michael Reid, running over and saying to me, "Mate, the AFP are in the building. They're raiding us." And I was like, "What do you mean?" Like, suddenly we were the story. We're not used to being the story. We're used to covering stories. So suddenly we found ourselves covering ourselves. They were in the building for most of the day, about 9 hours, I think it was. Their head of investigations, John Lyons, sat in the room and live tweeted everything that was going on, so the world knew. And he got like 10, 12,000 extra followers during this time. But why I included this in the book is because there was a line in that warrant that was used to raid the ABC that disturbed me then and disturbs me even more now as we talk about it. It gave police the power to alt, delete, copy or change our files in the course of their investigation at the ABC that day. So they're rifling through our files, emails, everything, and they had the power to delete, alter our files. And I thought to myself, well, incredibly disturbing. I'm not sure that there are bad eggs within the AFP, not even suggesting there are, that they would abuse that power. But the fact that that power existed really disturbed me. It's quoting a Crimes Act from over 100 years ago, you know, when we were going around in horse and cart. And so I wanted to include that in there because what if there was a bad egg in the AFP? How might that play out? Well, you know, Bailey gets a knock on the door.
Now, why far-right extremism? I mean, you've touched on China in your previous books, Russia, you're in Afghanistan. These themes run through all of your books. Why far-right extremism now?
Because I think like Islamist terrorism was for a long time, it's actually become a drumbeat in our lives. The modus operandi of a lot of these groups is to, you know, commit shocking acts of terrorism, as we've seen in Christchurch and El Paso, and before that Oslo. But there are a lot of people through misinformation that get sucked into this cause, and you know, it's a hop and a skip. But you know, there are people, you know, sitting around, you know, with the gulf. I mean, with the gap between rich and poor growing. We've seen with America, their problems are from within. There's a disintegration of America's democracy at the moment that, you know, they may pull back together.
Well, we saw the insurrection at the Capitol building this year.
Exactly. And there are a lot of people with very legitimate concerns around inequality. However, those people are being sucked into a different cause because they're given very simple solutions to complex problems. So if you look at even the protests we've seen going on in
Make
Melbourne,
America great again, drain the swamp.
Exactly.
Yeah, simple answers.
Yep. And, you know, people to blame, you know, it's them who did it, which is, you know, the Clintons, Obama, the former, the former leaders running America's democracy, that Washington, it's them, they're against us. They've always been letting us down. That is a big target for people. And then those disaffected people that I'm talking about, those that, could be unhappy with their lot in life, that they need someone to tell them that you do this and things will get better.
One of the things that you touch on in your book, and I thought was really well done, and it's difficult in any, particularly a thriller, page turner, to be able to introduce some nuance and subtlety. But you do this, and you do this around the question of what motivates people, what drives people to seek out that sort of ideology. Where does hate fester? I mean, there is a reason Donald Trump got elected. There is a reason that Donald Trump still, at the last election, despite losing, got more votes than any other sitting president in history. There's a reason that the Brexit vote got up. There's a reason that people look to populist demagogue figures, and the other side of politics, if you like, the left, the Hillary Clintons who denounce people as deplorables, carry some responsibility for this. And you weave this in, don't you? You're trying to explain what drives people to this, and that it's not just one side. The other side is not entirely blameless either.
Look, good government is always done from the centre. At the moment, we've got a very, very active, sneering left and a very, very active, sneering right. And they are trying to drag people from the centre each way. I think we've lost an ability at the moment to have a reasonable conversation around, issues that sometimes may affect us personally. I think, hopefully we're at a turning point. Hopefully enough's enough. But I think that it has been, I guess, it's trying to put this in a delicate way, but we're not great at listening to other people at the moment. And I think social media, coming back to, one of the big disruption I'm talking about, almost galvanizes you not to listen to people, because, I'll take it back to one further step to, a far right nationalist figure, or say I'll just profile someone, 20-year-old young man, can't get a job, is seeing other people given a leg up where he doesn't get a leg up. He's still living at home with his parents. He's online. He's got a lot of time in his hands. He's spending a lot of time online. So on YouTube, and some of this has changed. They're getting better at managing this stuff. Sky News got kicked off YouTube for a whole week for misinformation. But there was a long period of time there where this disaffected young man would be sitting in his room watching videos. The more of a video he watched, or he found one he liked, the more of those videos that got served up to him through the algorithms. And that's what we saw happen for about the last decade. It started to turn, but what you see then is it takes you further into the rabbit hole. And that's where these recruiters come from. So suddenly you feel like I'm an angry young man sitting in my bedroom in, let's just say, Palm Beach, which is going to be unlikely, but we'll say Palm Beach. And he's connecting with someone in El Paso, in Los Angeles, in Melbourne. So suddenly he's not alone, and he feels like there's an army of people out there with the same views as him. And we saw this happen with the extremist who shot up those mosques in Christchurch. Exactly, wrote his own manifesto, and I spent a lot of time reading these manifestos. And some of those far right, there's a guy called René Camus. Do not read him, but I spent a lot of time reading his stuff. French far right nationalist. He's a darling of the neo-Nazi white supremacist movement. Studying a lot of these people, what they write. These people are about sucking in the vulnerable and building a mass army any way they can. And it's happening here. It's happening all around the world. In fact, 18 months ago, the boss of ASIO, Mike Burgess, gave a speech, and he called out far-right nationalism and the threat of white supremacists as the biggest, single threat in terms of a new growing movement in Australia, and they were diverting a lot of resources to it. He called out a group called The Base. Now, the base,
which have now been listed as a terrorist.
exactly
group.
2 weeks ago, the base, along with Hezbollah, were listed as terrorist groups. The base have had connections with, as you may have seen or heard from some great reporting on the ABC on this background briefing, connections with those trying to be One Nation candidates. So these people are reaching in, you know, and they are making an impact, and they are here, and that is what's concerning. Yeah,
the enemy within.
Yeah.
What you're talking about there, you mentioned Rene Camus and others, but is what's known as identitarians, isn't it? This is what we're talking about. These are the wars of identity. And while you're talking about far right extremists, equally you could be talking about Islamist extremists. You know, Islamic State used the same methods to attract disaffected people from other parts of the world. We talk about Donald Trump and his messages of drain the swamp and make America great again. Well, in fact, Xi Jinping has his own version of make China great again. You know, Vladimir Putin has his own version of make Russia great again. Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to make Turkey great again. Viktor Orban wants to make Hungary great again. On and on it goes. And Bolsonaro, you know, Modi. And these are very popular leaders. What's interesting too, if you take China out and, you know, Russia with a small d democracy, but these people are democratically elected. You know, there's a wonderful line from Yeats, isn't it? That the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And that really sums up our age. But these people, Tim, are winning in the identity wars. That ability to prosecute that grievance, feed on resentment, historical resentment, a sense of being replaced or left behind. And you touch on a lot of the undercurrents of this. Immigration runs through your book. Immigration is one of the fault lines that we see, particularly in parts of Europe, that is driving people to the far right. And there are characters, you deal with immigration in the book, Sudanese immigration, Sudanese characters and what happens to them. So that also is a theme, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it is. But I think importantly, I wanted to write this book, The Enemy Within, after State of Fear. So State of Fear is about, you know, Islamist terrorism, you know, with a group in there based on the Islamic State group. I was kind of careful to make my next book about the other extremists out there, because what we saw with Islamist terrorism is that a lot of normal, ordinary Muslims got it tarnished with this brush. And that has sort of led to some of this intolerance, I guess, that we're seeing. And immigration, by the way, is the darling of capitalism. Like, it is the reason behind America's wealth, you know, and Australia's too. But it's just, I guess, the sensitivities around, you know,
it's about race and race. You know, you've already touched on that. Race also sits at the heart of this book.
Yeah, it does. It does. And look, I'm not the identity politics that you were talking about, though, just so I don't forget. When we're talking about like Russia and China particularly, because I feel like we're scaring people here. So Russia,
very well.
Yeah. So Russia and China. So Russia right now is spending a third of its federal budget on defense and security at home, and most of that's on security at home.
China actually spends more on security at home than it does on its defense. It's more afraid of what's going to happen inside its border than outside its border.
And that's right. And the reason I want to mention that is, and in Russia right now, there are more people in prison, more people being locked up as, you know, opposition activists, you know, journalists, than at the height of the Cold War, right? So those leaders are so scared of their own people that the enemy within there is actually democracy for them in those countries. So even though we're talking about this new world order and balance of power and the threat of war, there is that other strong possibility that those threats come up from within in those sorts of countries. However, the more scary side of that coin is that the fastest way to unite a country behind a leader who has problems is
pick an enemy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell us about Augustus Strong, because he's a fascinating character, and he's a character torn from the headlines himself, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. Of course, he's totally fictitious. Yeah, look, he's that far right, nationalist figure. He likes getting up and a champion of sort of so-called free speech. The kind of guy where people would say, look, I may not agree with everything he says, but I'll defend his right to say it. He is a very controversial figure. We've seen, several figures like this around the world. He's come to Australia to be able to give these incredibly lucrative, always lucrative speeches, and been given a special pass by the relevant
which does
minister.
remind us of a particular individual who did come to Australia, Milo Yiannopoulos.
Yeah, it does. And look, they are in the way I was talking about it earlier, they go looking for the disaffected person, and they will go to your touch points, which is they've got your job. You deserve this. Close the borders. There's nothing wrong, with our history. That the only order in the world is an Anglo order. Those sorts of touch points. And I guess because of political correctness, some people have found that refreshing, that people are just outright saying these extraordinary things and being able to say them, and through social media being celebrated for it.
Because
there
there is something at the heart of it, isn't it? Again, it appeals to that sense that people, and you have these people in the book who turn up to these rallies, and we may see this with the anti-vax rallies that we see right now, where you get people in heightened state and people feeling as if they're put upon and they're losing their freedom. It becomes a question of their identity, their political identity. These things often have something in them that is a germ of truth, or something that people can recognize, that is the opening, isn't it? It's the opening for the fear and the anxiety that is the handmaiden of the populist political figure.
Yeah, I mean,
and we can't ignore the fact that there is something there.
Yeah, there's a kernel of something. But as I said before, it's providing a very simplistic solution to more complex problems. I think with the protests that we've seen in Melbourne and other places around the country, we've seen them infiltrated by those white supremacist groups, and they absolutely go there to recruit. They go there to recruit people. And some of them have been sort of named. There's been some great reporting from 9 newspapers on this. 60 Minutes. They're turning up there to bring people into their cause. So there's there are people that are angry about compulsory vaccinations. There's people that have legitimate concerns around lockdowns. But all of them there with different things to be angry about. People that were questioning the powers in the new legislation in Victoria. Legitimate questions. They are legitimate questions. But when you get all these people at a protest, and then you get, and I'm not for a second sort of questioning, vaccines. I think, we trust in science, right? It's the facts that I was talking about. But on some of those other issues with governance and lockdowns. So you've got some people that are really angry because they've lost their job, and you can understand that. But they turn up to a protest, and a neo-Nazi puts his arm around him. He goes, "Hey, mate, I've got a solution for you."
I want to take some questions in a moment. So please, if you have your questions ready, look forward to hearing them. And if you're going online, send them through, and I think they'll relay those questions to me. I can put them to Tim. Before we get there, Tim, I just want to just ask you a few questions about your journey as a writer. Where did the love of this come from? I mean, it's tough. You're working a demanding job, long hours, and then you're going home and squeezing in time in the morning and time at night, and you have a family. Where did the love of this come from?
Well, it started with reading as a kid. I always had a house full of books. I don't really eat chocolate, never have. And so at Easter, mum and dad used to buy me a book instead of a box of some eggs. So I was a bit of an odd one out there. But for me, I was really interested because my dad writes books. We've got writers in the family. Virginia Woolf's actually a relative.
Really?
Yeah, I'll get it wrong, but it's my grandmother's cousin's aunt, something like that. Anyway, but we claim her, is what I'm saying. So look, it's in the blood, really.
But Bryce
and
Courtney was a friend of
Bryce
your dad?
Courtney's a very good friend of Dad's, and you know, I was lucky to have some really great conversations with him, you know, before he died, and got some advice from him. Number one of them just being, you know, the secret to writing is bum glue. And I've always remembered that, because if you're going to write, you just got to sit there, and you've got to, you know, you can have good days and bad days, but just sit there. So for me, the juggle is tough. I think I learned some tough lessons during my first book, to be honest. The Greater Good. I mean, I've got 2.5 books in a drawer that are practice books. You know, I've been writing since I was 20. But The Greater Good, which was the first book that was published, and I was lucky enough to get a 3-book deal with my publisher, Simon & Schuster. And
that's a big, you know, that's a big commitment, a big tick right there, to say that there are 3 books in this character and 3 books in this writer.
Well, look, I mean, I was very lucky they believed in me, but I was just determined to get better with every single book, and that I want to make a career of this. And I know that it's a long game, and I'm in it for the long game. But with that first book, it took me about 3.5 years. I was just chipping away. And when I say I learned some tough lessons, I was probably had a bit of tunnel vision and fitting those things around work, and maybe neglecting the family a little bit, which was tough for my wife. But I've gotten better at that. And now I tend to write early morning, just on weekends. I get a good 3 to 4 or 5 hours on weekends and fit it in.
You know, we're saying that you're drawing these stories from the headlines, and your own journalism feeds into that. And, you know, the conversations we have, and we talk through your books and what you're writing on. And but are you someone who plots all this out, or do you go where the story will take you, allow the characters to take you, where the writing leads you each day? What's your approach?
With the first book, I think I was more of a pantser, as they say, in that I had this sort of central idea that started with the murder, and I knew some of the key characters, and that's really it. With the second book, I knew I plotted it out a bit more. Had some tough lessons writing the third one, and absolutely plotted it out to be able to write it. And I tend to do that now. I will plot a book out. I may get going with writing a few chapters just to get a feel for it, because I'll always know the central idea. But I do tend to plot it out more. And that could actually be because of the way I write as well. I mean, I get my 2 windows on the weekend from 5:30 to, you know, depending on if we've got kids' sport, I'll get to 8 o'clock on a Saturday, and on Sunday I can write 5:30 till maybe 10. So I've got fixed windows, and you got fixed windows, you got to get words down. So I made a mistake by writing words and plot that wasn't, you know, quite working, but I just kept going. So now I pull back and I say, okay, what's the plot? I'm always thinking about the reader. I want to have the big moves through the book. I want to have the surprises and the twists.
Yeah, and you've really got that. I mean, that's, you know, these books, for those who haven't read them, it's that unexpected twist. It's that chapter that leaves you hanging, or you just know when to introduce that gear change. And that's been fantastic. Can we go to any questions? People have questions in the room. And if there are any questions, a lot of hands going up. This is great. And any questions online as well, they'll bring them down to me. Let's start here, and then we'll go here and here to get started. Yes, sir. Thank God for rugby.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, the question for those watching online is around how I sort of switch off and spend a lot of time in dark places, either writing or with my day job. Look, the writing process actually for me is really relaxing. It is a bit of a switch off. I've just got it compartmentalized in my corner of my brain here, and I love spending time with Bailey. So, but I read a lot, and my wife and I will watch TV series together. I try to drink
crime
less.
series.
Yeah, crime series. Okay, so yeah, there's a bit of darkness there, I guess, as well. But look, I coach my son's rugby team and have done for 4 years, and love it. I love weekend sport. Go to watch my daughter play netball. So that's a real that helps me. I exercise a lot. That helps me. Surf or cycle, walk the dog.
Walk the dog. Yes.
So the question is around the concerns around particularly younger people going down rabbit holes and not really having another source of news to go to because they get their news from social media. That lies a lot with the social media companies. They need to take more responsibility. There's some regulation that's been sort of stepping in to try to force them to do that. And they need to take that responsibility. I won't beat around the bush. That is what we've seen the last particularly decade is incredibly reckless. That people can, just share fake news as if it's news. And for other people who only get their news through Facebook to recognize it as news is deeply concerning. The Russians had a misinformation team working on the US election out of St. Petersburg with, I think, hundreds of people. I can't remember the number, but they're literally, pushing out messaging that would hit people's phones or through social media platforms, and it wasn't getting stopped. And then so people were reading these things and thinking they're true. So,
and we literally can't believe our eyes now because of deep fakes.
That's right.
They can be so incredibly convincing.
You have to read my book I'm working on now, Stan, about deep fakes. So look, I think media businesses, companies, mastheads, they've got, I think, a real tough job ahead, but they can double down on truth, facts, slow down the news cycle, try to kill the spin as well. It's a joint effort. But I do think if you think of television networks, if you think of, media companies, there's a charter that sort of governs the way, what they do. If Facebook and others had a more strict code around what they can actually broadcast, because they are the biggest broadcasters in the world, then that would help.
Well, you have a question here from a real fan, Tim. We'll go to another one in the room in just a moment, but this is one coming from online. How do you create such great characterizations? And this is, train spotting, such as the flight attendant in book 2.
Well, look, I always, in my books, I will either pepper them.
Remind people of the flight attendant in book 2.
Well, Marcus is a very, prim sort of proper flight attendant. It gets very angry with Bailey for not doing the right thing. Bailey, I should say, has like burn scars on his back after being, caught up in a bomb explosion. So look, I have a bit of fun sometimes with the characters in my books, in that I'll always use a name of, a close friend or something. And so I'm pretty sure I know where that question's come from, because that's exactly what I did then. I've got another friend demanding royalties from a different character.
There's one over here.
A question from Michael Robotham, who doesn't really need introduction, but has given me some great advice over the years as I got on this writing journey. So thank you for that, Michael. His question's around some of the legislation that's trying to put heat on these social media.
And we've just seen
companies.
the Magnitsky Act is going to include online stuff as well, which is a first.
Yeah. Michael's question around whether we would see some sort of legislation that would identify the trolls, basically make people use their correct names online. Look, I'm an optimist, and unfortunately, I can't see it happening for a while, if ever, which is really sad, because that's where a lot of the damage is being done. I've been trolled myself. Stan, you aren't on social media.
My wife gets my hate mail that she deals with.
Yeah, it's shocking. People get to hide in the shadows, say whatever the hell they like, they're cowards.
And just make stuff up too. That's it. Now my wife is one never to miss out on a question. She's been raising her hand, and I've been, standing here trying to avoid her, but she's and she just looked at me a minute and went.
My next book, again, I've got the idea from something said by the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, which was that there are more foreign spies or their proxies operating in Australia than at any time since the height of the Cold War. So I'm having a look what the Russians are up to. I'm having a look at the Magnitsky Act. and why the Magnitsky Act is, what's his first name? I can't remember. Magnitsky, Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian who exposed a Russian lawyer who exposed some corruption, deep-seated corruption, right in the Kremlin, and he was jailed because of exposing that. And then they turned it around on him, put him in prison, and he died in prison. He had some good friends and contacts in US Congress, and they passed what's known as the Magnitsky Act. And this is around a decade ago, I think. And what that did was target the wealthy Russians and those around the world who've been involved in human rights abuses. Australia, for some bizarre reason,
just passed their own,
has taken 10 years or so to do it. So I'm having a look at that and having a bit of fun with the reasons maybe why they haven't, or it took so long. In terms of those big global sort of moves and powers, there's no war. It's a kind of a cold war, if you like. The question for those online is around those that voted for Donald Trump and that they would get their news from reputable sources as well, yet they still voted for him. Look, the reason is, and I touched on this earlier, is that, you know, a lot of people are angry and they're looking for they want to see a different approach. The gulf between rich and poor in America is growing every day. There's a lot of people that are wondering why America's fighting all of these wars overseas, why manufacturing jobs have gone overseas, why they're not supporting local business, sectors in America to grow the economy that way. Of course, that ignores the whole idea of capitalism, which is you get a country that can make things more cheaply so that you can consume more and buy things more cheaply. But so it's very complicated. What Trump did is he stood up and he said, that whole system we've all been living doesn't work anymore. Just come with me. And he didn't really have many great solutions. He had some things that he did, like turn all the coal-fired power stations back on, or try to bring more manufacturing jobs home. And there's some things that people would argue and have a good argument for it that he did that were great. But on a lot of other issues, he not so great.
I want to squeeze in two more if I can. Just to anyone in the room, if you really want to understand what we've seen in America with inequality and that divide, that class divide in America, which opens the door to race divide and everything else, there is a wonderful book, one of the best books I've read in the past couple of years, called Deaths of Despair by two economists, Anne Case and her husband, Angus Deaton, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. It, line by line, on the numbers, reveals the cancer of inequality that is killing America and killing American democracy. It is a sensational book. Can I get one more, or two more? Let's do two. Who wanted to ask? Was there anyone at the back who had their hand up? No, there was one here. You had a question? Yeah, one here, and then I'll take here, and then we can. Yeah, okay. Crime writing, not turning to. No, it'd be a while till I'll write crime, I suspect. I did have an idea, but anyway, yeah, we'll see.
He's writing something. That's all you need to know. The question around why so many journalists turn to crime writing, or to writing novels, I reckon, is probably a broader. I think a lot of
unemployment, redundancy.
Yeah. Look, in some of them, that's definitely the case. That was definitely the case for me. Unfortunately, I'm at the stage of my career, I've got to keep working. I just think that a lot of journalists, we're the great observers. We're really interested in the world, and we have something to say. And it's quite liberating in a novel where you can actually write and have a more, start a broader conversation, have some, insights. I think in fiction, you can get a lot closer to the truth than you can with nonfiction. So I find that liberating.
Just a final quick last question here. Thank you. Yeah, I suspect that's where the Magnitsky Act comes in, in the next book.
So you're just talking about. So you're talking about dark money and how it's sort of being used to fund some of this sort of more.
It's also in The Enemy Within, isn't it? Because
don't give it away.
No.
So you got to read the book. So yes, I think about it a lot.
Very, Very close to a spoiler. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming along. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to Tim. Thank you for all being here. Thanks for being online as well. And buy the books. Buy the books, and we'll get another one.
Thank you.